Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbidi Bobbidi Books. My name is Ellie and today I'm going to be filming my top 10 books of 2022. So this is definitely one of my favourite videos to film here on BookTube, and it's one of my favourite videos to watch other people do. I just love chatting about all of my favourite books. I love hearing what everyone else's favourite books were. So I am so excited and I have so many amazing books to chat you through today. I am choosing 10 books that I really enjoyed in the year of 2022. So these books weren't necessarily published in 2022, it's just that I so happened to read them in that year, and yeah, I love them all. So yes, without further ado, I'm gonna get cracking because we've got quite a few books to talk through, especially because I have included some honorary mentions because I couldn't resist. So yeah, I decided that I didn't want to put any sequels in my top 10 list because it just didn't feel right, and I needed to whittle it down somehow, so I decided to not include sequels in my actual top 10, but I had to mention a couple in the honorary mentions section. And the first one is The Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. So this is the second book in the Daevabad trilogy, and I love this one. This really elevated the series for me. If you haven't heard of this series before, it's a fantasy series that's inspired by Middle Eastern culture and Middle Eastern folklore. And in the first book we follow one of our main characters, Nari, and it takes place in 18th century Cairo. And Nari is working as a con artist on the streets of Cairo, and she has this affinity for healing which she uses to her advantage. And the story takes off when she accidentally summons this jinn warrior when she's doing this ritual as part of her con, and it's a big surprise to her that this jinn warrior is summoned. And it also catches the attention of these magical beings known as the Ifrit, and Nari and this jinn warrior ends up essentially on the run, and they seek refuge in this magical city known as Daevabad, and that's kind of where the rest of the series continues on. We also get a perspective of someone who is in Daevabad, a prince called Ali, and in this second book we also get some other POVs as well. So it just feels like this second book is a real big expansion of the world. We get more intricate plot, we get more politics, we get more world building, we get more magic, we get more character development. It just felt so much more kind of established and more complex, and I just loved it. So yeah, I enjoyed the first book, I loved the second book, and I'm really excited to see where the series goes. Okay, the next honorary mention that I have is The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. So again, this is a sequel, so I didn't want to put it on my actual top 10 list, but I love this series. This again is the middle book in a adult fantasy series, and I'm sure you've probably heard people talking about this book before, but if you haven't, the first book follows a group of people who come together to try and overthrow this evil lord ruler. So it's got a rebellion plotline, and the people who all come together, they all have this really unique ability to harness the power of metals. So they're known as allomancers, and they can basically eat small flakes of metals and then burn them in their stomachs to harness different powers, which is really cool, and it's just fun. Who doesn't love a rebellion plotline? There's also quite a few shocking twists in the first book and loads of fantastic characters, and it's so much fun. I will say this second book feels a little bit slower than the first book, especially the first half, and it's a little bit more heavy on the politics, but it really ramps up towards the end, and it ends on a big reveal that has me very intrigued to see where the series goes from here. Okay, my next honorary mention is a graphic novel, and I just couldn't not put this on this list. This is Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. I read this entire graphic novel series last year, more or less in one sitting, because I just couldn't put it down. It was so addictive. I read it just before the Netflix show came out because I wanted to read the original version, the original story first, and I had such a good time. I'm not going to go on about this one too much because I'm sure you've probably heard lots of people rabbiting on about it, but it's essentially a contemporary graphic novel, and it is a high school romance between Nick and Charlie, the two main characters, and it's ultimately really heartwarming and fuzzy and sweet and wholesome. And yes, it does talk about some issues that a lot of teenagers face in high school. It talks about bullying and finding your identity and learning about your sexuality and trying to find your place in your friendship group and all of those things that teens go through in high school. But ultimately it is really, really positive and uplifting, and I just fell in love with Nick and Charlie. And the final honorary mention is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. Again, this is another booktube star. I'm sure you've probably heard of this one before because everybody who's read it seems to love it, and for good reason, because this is the ultimate cozy fantasy. This is a high fantasy with low stakes, and it follows a orc barbarian called Viv who decides to hang up her sword in exchange for opening up a coffee shop. So she decides to leave her warrior barbarian lifestyle and she wants to lead a more peaceful life, so she moves to this new town and she opens up this coffee shop, and it's just about her finding her place in this new community, making new friends, starting a new job, and it's so wholesome. There's a real sense of community in this book and it's just very, very cozy. So if you haven't read this one yet, I highly, highly recommend. Okay, now on to the main event. I'm going to be talking you through my top 10 books. These are going to be in no particular order. I'm just going to pull randomly off this stack that I've got next to me. And yeah, let's start with this one. So this is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This was actually the first book that I read in 2022, and I just knew as soon as I started it that it was going to end up on this favourites list because I immediately fell in love with the writing, I immediately fell in love with the story and the characters and the world. And you know when you just read a book and it clicks with you? I had that experience with this book because it is just so wonderful. This is the first book in a fantasy duology, and we follow our main character Laszlo Strange, who is an orphan of war, and he grew up in a monastery, but he's always been really fascinated with these stories about a lost city known as Weep. And then one day he gets the opportunity to go and try and find this lost city, and the story kind of goes on from there really. I don't want to say too much because I feel like it's better to go in without knowing too much, but we do get two perspectives in here. Again, I'm not going to say too much about the second perspective because I feel like it's nice to uncover that for yourself, but it is so vivid. Like, I really remember seeing some of the scenes that are described in here because it's just so beautiful and creative. It also has one of my favorite romances in here, and it's not a steamy romance, it's definitely not that kind of thing, but there's just such a sweet and kind of innocent type of romance that's explored in this book between two characters who have never really had the opportunity to love before, and it's just wonderful. I was absolutely swept away. It was breathtaking. Please go read this book if you haven't already. Okay, so next we have this little book. So this is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed this one because it's quite strange, and I feel like it's one of those books that's either going to work for you or it isn't because it's quite strange. So this is about a man called Piranesi who lives in this massive house. So when I say massive, I mean the top floors are up in the clouds, the bottom floors are submerged in the ocean, and the halls just go on infinitely. It's just massive. His entire world is this house, and the house has these statues in it which are really interesting, and there are birds that live in this house, and there are fish that live in the seas in the bottom of the house, but there's only one other person to Piranesi's knowledge who lives in this house, and he just refers to them as the other. So Piranesi lives a very isolated and lonely kind of existence, but he is quite content. He considers himself a scientist, and he spends his day going about the house documenting everything that he finds and trying to map out the house as best as he can, and he enjoys what he does. And this book is written as his journal entries, so we're literally seeing him, his thoughts, and we're just following along with him day to day as he's going about his life in the house, and we as the reader start to see that there might be something a little bit strange going on, that Piranesi might not necessarily be aware of, and it was just really interesting. It's got a bit of a mystery plot line to it, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. So if you're looking for a short, weird book, highly recommend. The next book that I have on my top 10 list is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I really enjoyed this one. This is a very dark and very gritty fantasy story. It's definitely adult, and it has dark academia vibes to it because it's set in Yale University. So in this story we follow our main character Alex, who has made some pretty bad decisions during her life. She dropped out of school early, she started dating this drug dealer boyfriend, she's got herself into quite a few dangerous situations, and after one particularly horrific event she ends up in hospital, and there she is met by this mysterious benefactor who offers her an opportunity to turn her life around that she can't resist. So this benefactor wants her to go to Yale University and to become a member of the secret society, the House of Lethe. So Alex decides to take him up on this offer. She goes to the university, she becomes a member of the secret society, and she discovers that there are 8 other secret societies running in Yale that are all using dark and scary kind of magic for political and personal gain. So a lot of the members of these societies are people who are in the elite classes, so it's wealthy, rich, you know, elite people, politicians, people like that, and they do dark practices for their own gain. And Alex's job as a member of the Ninth House, the House of Lethe, her job is to keep check on all of these other secret societies and to make sure that the dark practices that they are doing don't get out of control. So it's such an interesting concept, and what I loved about this book is the setting, because it's so real, and I really enjoyed how the author incorporated real places and real things with the fantasy elements as well. There's also a great mystery in here because there's someone who dies on campus, so our main character is trying to find out what happened there, and her mentor also goes missing. So it's a lot of fun twisty turny mystery type plot lines going in this book, and it's just a great time. It is dark though, there are some really difficult scenes to read. Definitely check out the content warnings before going into this one, but if you want something that is a little bit different, I would recommend checking out this book, especially because we've got the sequel coming out soon. Okay, so next up we have House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. So this is a standalone, I think it's a young adult fantasy novel, but it definitely leans towards horror as well. And this one is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale, and I really enjoyed this one. I was really surprised by how eerie it is and how gothic and creepy it is. I just wasn't expecting that from a fairy tale retelling, and I just loved it. So in this book we're following our main character Anna Lee, who is a princess, and she lives in this isolated manor by the sea with her family. So she lives with her father, her stepmother, and her, I think it's her 8 sisters, because there were originally 12 of them, but there have been a series of tragedies and quite a few of her sisters have actually ended up passing away. So yeah, there's a lot of talk around town that the family that live in this manor house, this royal family, are actually cursed, and that's the reason why a lot of these princesses are dying. But Annalie doesn't believe that there's a curse on her family, but she does believe that there is something suspicious about the most recent death of one of her sisters, and so she decides to kind of investigate to try and see what's going on with her family and what happened to her sister. And alongside that we're following along with, you know, sisters who are tired of forever being in mourning, and they decide to sneak out at night to attend these glittering balls in secret. And yeah, it's really good. I don't want to give too much away, but what I loved about this story again was the beautiful descriptions and the vivid imagery in here, and I loved a lot of the scenes that were equally beautiful as they were eerie and terrifying. Like, I really enjoyed that blend, and there were some scary scenes that have definitely stuck with me and that I can still remember, even though I read this one quite a few months ago. So yeah, if you're looking for something creepy and you like a fairy tale retelling, definitely check out this book. Okay, so the next book on my top 10 list is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. So this is the first book in his First Law trilogy, which is a epic adult grimdark fantasy series, and I just fell in love with the characters in this first book. This is definitely a character driven story rather than a plot driven story, especially this first book, because we're really establishing a whole cast of characters in this first book because it's multi-POV, and I just really loved all the different characters and getting to know them, because you spend a lot of time with lots of different characters and they're all quite well realised, well fleshed out. They're all morally grey, they're not necessarily likeable, but they're just all very interesting to read about, and yeah, I just loved it. So yeah, there's quite a few characters in this first book. I think the standout ones are Glocta, who is a ex-war hero, and he was quite a dashing, handsome character back in the day. He was an excellent swordsman, but then he got captured by the enemy and he was tortured for many years. And so now he is quite a jaded character. He's also disabled and he has like no teeth, and he walks with a cane. He's in a lot of pain every day. He suffers with chronic pain, and yeah, he's quite a cynical character, but he is so interesting to read about. I love that we see his thoughts because he's so sarcastic and it's just hilarious. And yeah, so he now works as a member of the King's Inquisition, and he actually works as a torturer himself. So yeah, he's such an interesting character. We've then got Logan Ninefingers, who is kind of like a barbarian warrior, and he's from the north, but he becomes separated from the rest of his gang, from the rest of his group. We've also got a man called Giselle, who is a very selfish, very pompous nobleman, but he's also a really skilled fencer, and he is taking part in this fencing competition. And we also have a character called Biaz, who is the first of the Magi, and he is a powerful magician, but he's also kind of grumpy. And yeah, we slowly see all of these different characters and how their fates become intertwined, and it's on the backdrop of a politically tense situation, and it's just excellent. I highly recommend this book. Next we have a horror book. So this is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. This is a horror book about killer mermaids. Need I say more? I really enjoyed this one, a lot more than I was expecting to actually. And what I really enjoyed about this is that it kind of made you feel like killer mermaids could be a potential real threat, because the way that it's described in the story is very scientific. It's talking a lot about marine biology and things like that, which made it feel like a very grounded horror story rather than just a silly monster story, which I really enjoyed. But basically in this book we're following a girl called Tori, who is a sonar specialist, and she is obsessed with mermaids, and she has been ever since her sister mysteriously went missing. So her sister was working for this company called Imagine Entertainment, I think that's what it was called. She was basically working as a reporter on this ship which was filming a mockumentary about mermaids, and the ship and everybody on board mysteriously went missing and were never found. No bodies were ever found, no shipwreck was ever found. It's all a big mystery, but there was some footage that was leaked from the ship which seemed to show some kind of mermaid-like creatures attacking the people on board the ship. So ever since that footage was leaked and was seen by Tori, she has dedicated her life to studying marine biology and to trying to prove that these mermaids exist and trying to find out exactly what happened to her sister. And then one day she gets offered the opportunity to go and investigate the area of water where the ship went missing and to join a crew of other scientists to try and explore that area and trying to prove whether or not these mermaid-like creatures do actually exist. And yeah, we follow this crew as they take part in their scientific investigations, and there's lots of science talk in here, so if that's not your jam then you might want to stay clear of this one. But yeah, it was just fascinating seeing the different characters and seeing this slow build up of tension as things started to go wrong. And we had quite an interesting mix of characters on board. We had lots of different types of scientists that had different views, that had different areas of specialty. We also had some people who were just there as kind of like soldiers who just wanted to kill things, and we had a reporter there. So it was just quite an interesting mix of characters, and it was really interesting seeing how tensions built between the characters. There was also a little bit of a romance plotline at one point, and it was just really fascinating. And it was also a really diverse group of characters as well, so we had good representation in here, and there was some discussion about oppression and marginalization in here as well, which I did also enjoy. Of course, there is also gory horror scenes, as you would expect from a horror book, but yeah, I enjoyed this one a lot more than I thought I would. Next up we have Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. So I filmed a dedicated review video, spoiler free, for this book already, so I'm going to try and keep this one brief, and I'll just link that video down below if you want to hear more of my thoughts. But this is such a fun adult fantasy. It's the first in a duology, and while it's adult, I would say it's a good one for branching from young adult through to adult, because there were some themes and tropes and things in this book that you tend to see in younger fantasy stories. But I really enjoyed this one. This is about a girl called Xing Yin, who is the daughter of the moon goddess, and essentially her mother has been exiled to the moon for stealing the emperor's elixir of immortality. And so Xing Yin is born on the moon, and she lives a very isolated life with her mother. She's kept a secret because no one knew that the moon goddess was pregnant when she was exiled, so for Xing Yin's safety she is kept hidden. But everything changes when she accidentally flares her magic one day, and that makes her become known to the Celestial Emperor. So the Celestial Emperor comes to the moon to investigate what this sudden surge of energy was, and Xing Yin is forced to flee her mother and flee her home on the moon, and she ends up traveling to the Celestial Empire, and she has to kind of establish a new life for herself with the goal of eventually being able to go back to the moon to free her mother from her imprisonment. And yeah, it's just a really fun time. It's written in several sections, and there's a bit of a time jump between each section, and we spend time in different areas during different sections. There's a part in this story where she is training to become a soldier, which is quite cool. There's also a love triangle in here, which I actually think was done really well. And just all in all, I enjoyed the vivid imagery in here. I loved that it's a Chinese inspired retelling. I loved our main character, her progression through the book, and I just had a really fun time with this one. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to reading the sequel to this, hopefully soon. Next we have another horror book, and this is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This is a classic horror book, and I really enjoyed this one. It's actually one that I've found myself thinking about after I've read it for quite a long time, if you know what I mean. Like, it really makes you think and kind of gets under your skin, and I just really enjoyed that about this book. So this is a story about this house, Hill House, and this house has been rumoured to be haunted, and basically there's this man who's trying to prove the existence of hauntings, and so he decides to pull together a group of people to come and spend time in Hill House because he knows that the house is rumoured to be haunted, and he's hoping that they will experience something whilst they're there, and they can document it and they can find some kind of evidence of a haunting. And the whole book is told from the perspective of a woman who's invited to spend time in the house. She's called Nellie, and she is quite an interesting character. She's got quite a traumatic background, and she's also a little bit strange. She finds it difficult to connect with people, and it becomes quickly apparent that she is particularly susceptible to the influence of the house, because in this story it's very much that there's something strange about the actual house rather than there being like ghosts and stuff, which is really interesting. And things start to get weird, and it's not necessarily very clear whether it's our main character becoming affected by the house, or if it's to do with her personality. But it's so interesting, and I really enjoyed the fact that we saw her thoughts, because her thoughts really showed how paranoid she was at times and how strangely she was interpreting certain situations. And it also painted her as an interesting character. So a lot of the other people in the book described her as being like quite quiet, quite sensitive, you know, a nice person, and then we would see her thoughts and she would be thinking some pretty nasty things. And so it's just quite interesting, and just makes you think about how we only ever know kind of our own interpretation of what someone's like. We never really truly know what's going on underneath the surface. And yeah, it was really creepy. It's quite slow paced though, and I will say it's not in your face horror, so don't go into this one expecting it to be like the TV show, because it's much quieter than that. There's a lot of quiet moments, but it's one of those that just is, it just makes you feel a little bit eerie. And yeah, it ends really abruptly as well, which I feel like some people might like, some people might not like, but I personally really enjoyed this one. Next up we have a novella called A Psalm for the Wild Built, written by Becky Chambers. I don't actually have the physical copy, so I'm going to put a picture up on the screen for you because I read it on my Kindle. But I really enjoyed this little novella, and I think I enjoyed it much more than I was expecting to, because I had fairly low expectations, I think, because I don't normally gel with novellas. I prefer longer novels, and I didn't know a huge amount about it, but I really loved this little story. So this is a sci-fi story, and we follow our main character, who is a monk. They are a tea monk, and they decide to leave their life in the city and they decide to become a traveling tea monk. So they have this little wagon that they pedal around the countryside, and they go from village to village, and at each village they set up a little tea stall where people can come and offload their worries to the tea monk, and they will brew them a special cup of tea. And it's just so wholesome, such a cute idea. And on our monk's travels they end up finding this robot, and it's actually the first time a human and a robot have actually interacted with each other, because when robots became sentient they decided to separate themselves from humanity. And we just follow the two of them as they're getting to know each other, and they have some really interesting conversations about morality and what it means to have consciousness, and what it means to be alive, and what, you know, what it means to have a purpose in your life. And it's just really wholesome, and I just loved the characters, and I can't stop thinking about it. And the world was also really cool. It was really beautifully described. A lot of the humans live at one with nature. They live in a way that's kind of harmonious with nature, and it was just beautiful and uplifting and wonderful. So definitely check that out if you think that sounds interesting. And then last but by no means least, we have A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So this is a Dracula retelling, and it's told from the perspective of his first wife, Constanta, I think her name is. And I really was blown away by this book. Again, it's one that I know has been hyped up online, and so I didn't want to set my expectations too high. I didn't really know what to expect going into this one, other than that it was going to be a vampire story, and I tend to like vampire stories. But I was blown away by the writing and by some of the themes that were discussed in this book. So basically this is a book that's told in letter format. So it's written as if Constanta, Dracula's first bride, is writing a letter to Dracula, and that just felt like a really raw and real way to tell this story, which is a very personal story. And I know it sounds strange to call this like a real story, considering it's a story about vampires, but it's also a story about being in an abusive relationship, and what it's like to feel like you don't have control, and what it's like to love someone but to know that they're not good for you, or that they're not necessarily a good person. And it's also a story about different types of love as well, because there's a polyamorous relationship in here, and it's really interesting seeing our main character and the way they love different people in this relationship. And it was just a really beautiful and also heartbreaking story, and the prose is also absolutely gorgeous. It reads kind of old-fashioned, but that was just perfect for this type of story, and I just loved it. I really enjoyed our main character. I thought she was fascinating to read the perspective of, and you really felt for her as you were reading her letters, because again it felt like a very personal and raw kind of moment, and the fact that she was writing all these things to Dracula, it was just, I really enjoyed it. If you think that that sounds interesting, definitely check this one out, but definitely check out the trigger warnings for this one. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. I really loved all of these books I've mentioned, obviously, because they're my top 10 of 2022, but I'd really love to hear your thoughts on them too. If you've read any of them, please do drop me a comment. I'd love to have a chat with you about it, and let me know if you're thinking of picking up any of these books after watching this video, or let me know what your favourite books were from last year, because I'd love to hear from you. Or if you just want to let me know that you're here, you can always just drop me a little emoji in the comment section, maybe a little heart emoji, and that way I will know that you're there and I can say hi. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more from me, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!